North Sea airspace. March 14, 1943. 2:47 a.m. 21-year-old Flight Sergeant Peter Hastings sat in the cramped navigator compartment of a Handley Page Halifax bomber, watching his compass swing 15 degrees off heading as the aircraft climbed through layered cloud at 18,000 feet. The instrument was malfunctioning. The heading was wrong. The formation was scattering. And in 43 minutes, 22 bombers carrying 11,000 pounds of ordnance each were supposed to arrive over a ball-bearing factory in Schweinfurt, Germany, a target so critical that missing it meant the mission failed and the crews died for nothing. But Peter had a method, an unauthorized calibration technique, using star positions and magnetic deviation patterns that every navigation instructor in Bomber Command had explicitly forbidden. He had been reprimanded twice for using it. Once more, and he would be grounded. But the compass was lying, the formation was lost, and Peter had 11 seconds to decide whether to follow regulations into disaster or break the rules and trust what he'd taught himself in secret. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Peter Hastings was not supposed to be a navigator. He was supposed to be an engineer, following his father into the family firm that manufactured precision instruments for textile machinery in Manchester. Peter had grown up surrounded by gears and calibration tools, learning to measure tolerances in thousandths of an inch, understanding that precision was not optional but essential. His father had taught him that machines did not lie, that if an instrument gave an incorrect reading, the fault was either in the instrument or in the operator's understanding. That lesson had shaped Peter's entire approach to problems. Measure carefully, verify constantly, trust data over intuition. But that lesson would be tested and ultimately inverted when Peter discovered that sometimes instruments did lie, and that understanding why they lied was more valuable than trusting them blindly. The war had interrupted everything. Peter was 17 in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. His father's factory was almost immediately converted to war production, retooling to manufacture components for aircraft instruments. Peter worked on production line, learning how altimeters, airspeed indicators, and compasses were built, calibrated, and tested. He became fascinated by the complexity, by the way these devices translated physical phenomena like air pressure, magnetic fields, and centrifugal force into information pilots could use. He read everything he could find about navigation, aeronautics, and instrument theory, and he began to notice something that troubled him. The instruments were calibrated for standard conditions, sea level temperature and pressure, stable magnetic environments, steady flight. But operational conditions were never standard. Temperature varied with altitude. Magnetic fields were distorted by the aircraft's metal structure and electrical systems. Atmospheric pressure fluctuated, and yet the instruments reported readings as if these variables did not exist. They were precise, but they were not always accurate. Peter enlisted in the Royal Air Force in 1941. Shortly after his 19th birthday, he requested assignment to a technical trade, hoping to work on instrument maintenance or engineering. Instead, the RAF's assessment process identified his aptitude for mathematics and spatial reasoning and assigned him to navigator training. Peter was disappointed initially. He wanted to work with equipment, not operate it. But navigator training turned out to be exactly what his mind needed. Navigation was applied physics, constantly solving problems of position, speed, wind drift, magnetic variation, and time. It was engineering in motion. Peter excelled. He graduated top of his class and was assigned to 76th Squadron, flying Halifax bombers out of Linton-on-Ouse in Yorkshire. His first operational mission was in November 1942, a raid on Turin, Italy. Peter's job was to guide the bomber from England across France, over the Alps, to the target, then back. He had maps, a compass, a sextant for celestial navigation, and a G radio navigation system that provided position fixes within a limited range of the British coast. The flight was 10 hours, most of it over enemy territory in darkness, with German night fighters and anti-aircraft fire creating constant threats. Peter navigated successfully. The bomber reached the target, dropped its bombs, and returned home. But during the mission, Peter noticed something disturbing. The compass readings did not match the celestial observations. When he shot star positions with the sextant and calculated the aircraft's heading based on those positions, the results were consistently different from what the compass indicated, sometimes by as much as 10 or 12 degrees. He reported the discrepancy to the pilot, who checked with other aircraft in the formation. Their compasses showed the same headings. The consensus was that Peter's celestial navigation was an error, that he had miscalculated or misidentified stars. Peter accepted this explanation, but remained uneasy. He knew his calculations were correct, which meant the compasses were wrong. Over the next 3 months, Peter flew 14 more missions. On each one, he performed both compass navigation and celestial navigation, comparing the results. The pattern held. The compasses consistently deviated from true heading, and the deviation varied depending on altitude, geographic location, and time of night. Peter began to suspect that the compasses were being affected by factors the standard calibration did not account for. He researched magnetic variation, the difference between magnetic north and true north caused by the Earth's magnetic field irregularities. Variation was well documented, printed on navigation charts, and navigators routinely adjusted for it. But Peter realized there was another phenomenon at work: magnetic deviation, distortion caused by the aircraft itself. Every piece of metal, every electrical system, every running engine created magnetic fields that influenced the compass. Aircraft compasses were supposed to be calibrated on the ground to account for this, but ground calibration assumed stable conditions. In flight, with engines at different power settings, electrical systems switching on and off, and the aircraft maneuvering, the deviation changed constantly. Peter developed a hypothesis. If he could measure the deviation in real time during flight, he could correct the compass readings and navigate more accurately. But how do you measure deviation when the compass is the only instrument that provides heading? The answer, Peter realized, was celestial navigation. If he shot star positions and calculated true heading from those observations, then compared that true heading to the compass heading, the difference was the total error, variation plus deviation. Variation was known from the charts. So deviation was simply total error minus variation. Once he knew the deviation, he could apply it as a correction factor to future compass readings, at least until conditions changed and he needed to recalculate. Peter tested this method on his next mission, a raid on Essen in January 1943. He shot star positions every 15 minutes, calculated true heading, measured the compass error, and applied corrections. The result was striking. His navigation was more accurate. He brought the bomber to the target within 2 minutes of the planned time and within half a mile of the planned position, far better than the typical errors of 5 to 10 miles. The pilot noticed. The bomb aimer noticed. They asked Peter what he had done differently. Peter explained his deviation correction method. The pilot was impressed, but cautioned that if Peter's technique contradicted standard procedures, he needed to clear it with the navigation leader. Peter approached the squadron's navigation leader, a flight lieutenant named Jeffrey Marsh, and explained his method. Marsh listened, then shook his head. "That is not how we navigate," Marsh said. "Compass headings are verified by multiple aircraft in formation. If one compass disagrees, it is faulty and the aircraft aborts. We do not recalibrate instruments in flight based on calculations. That introduces error, not removes it." Peter argued that his method was based on solid observation and mathematics, that it measurably improved accuracy. Marsh was unmoved. "Your technique assumes that your celestial navigation is perfect and that the compass is wrong. That is backwards. The compass is a tested, calibrated instrument. Your sextant observations are subject to human error, atmospheric distortion, and misidentification. You are adjusting a reliable instrument based on an unreliable one. I am ordering you to stop. Use standard compass navigation. If you suspect a compass fault, report it and we will verify with other aircraft. Do not improvise." Peter complied outwardly, but he continued testing his method privately, recording deviations in a notebook, refining his calculations, proving to himself that the technique worked. He did not apply the corrections during navigation. He followed the compass as ordered, but he tracked what the corrections would have been and compared the results. In 8 missions, his deviation-corrected headings would have reduced navigation errors by an average of 40%. The data was undeniable, but Marsh had forbidden the technique. Peter was trapped between what he knew worked and what he was ordered to do. Then came the mission briefing for March 14, 1943. The target was Schweinfurt, a city in southern Germany that housed a concentration of ball-bearing factories. Ball bearings were critical to German war production, used in aircraft engines, tank transmissions, U-boat machinery, and countless other applications. Intelligence estimated that destroying the Schweinfurt factories would reduce German ball-bearing production by 40%, crippling their ability to build and maintain military equipment. The target was small, heavily defended, and deep inside Germany. The mission would require precision navigation over 800 miles, much of it through clouds and weather that would make visual navigation impossible. 22 Halifax bombers would attack in a coordinated strike, timed to overwhelm the defenses. Success depended on all aircraft arriving at the target within a 3-minute window. Any aircraft that missed the timing would face the full weight of German anti-aircraft fire alone and would likely be shot down. The briefing emphasized navigation discipline. Fly the planned headings. Maintain formation. Use G navigation while in range. Then switch to dead reckoning and compass headings. Do not deviate from the flight plan. The weather forecast predicted scattered clouds over the North Sea, increasing to overcast over Germany, with tops reaching 22,000 feet. Turbulence was expected. Winds aloft were estimated at 60 knots from the northwest. Peter studied the charts, calculated checkpoints, and prepared his navigation log. He also calculated what the magnetic deviation would likely be based on his previous observations. He did not plan to use the calculations, but he wanted them ready just in case. The mission launched at 10:15 p.m. on March 13th. 22 bombers took off in sequence, formed up over the North Sea, and headed east. Peter's aircraft, Halifax LKJ, was part of the lead section, one of the first aircraft in the formation. Peter navigated using G until the signal faded at the edge of its range, approximately 200 miles from the English coast. Then he switched to dead reckoning, using airspeed, compass heading, and estimated wind to calculate position. The weather was worse than forecast. Clouds were solid from 12,000 feet to above their cruising altitude of 18,000 feet. Visibility was zero. The formation could not maintain visual contact. Aircraft were flying on instruments, holding headings and altitudes, trusting that everyone else was doing the same. Peter shot star positions whenever breaks in the clouds allowed, but opportunities were rare. At 2:35 a.m., the formation was over central Germany, approximately 40 minutes from the target. Peter shot a star position through a brief gap in the clouds, calculated his position, and froze. They were off course. The compass heading had drifted north, pushed by stronger than expected winds and magnetic deviation Peter had predicted but had not been allowed to correct. According to a celestial fix, they were 15 miles north of the planned track and drifting further. If they continued on the current heading, they would miss Schweinfurt entirely, arriving over empty countryside with no visual references to correct their position. Peter quickly calculated a corrected heading that would bring them back on track. The correction required a 15-degree turn to south and an additional 2 minutes of flight time. He informed the pilot, Squadron Leader Alan Crawford. Crawford was skeptical. "The compass shows we are on heading," Crawford said. "How could we be 15 miles off track?" Peter explained his celestial observation and the deviation correction. Crawford hesitated. Other aircraft in the formation were holding the same heading. If Peter was right and Crawford turned, they would separate from the formation. If Peter was wrong, they would be alone, vulnerable, and lost. Crawford made a decision. He would trust the compass and the formation. They would not turn. Peter felt the weight of the moment. He could accept the decision, follow orders, and hope that the compass was right and his calculations were wrong. Or he could push harder, argue, demand that Crawford trust him. But demanding trust without authority was a gamble. If he was wrong, he would destroy Crawford's confidence and probably end his own career. Peter looked at his notes, at the star position he had just shot, at the deviation calculations he had refined over months of observation. He was not guessing. This was data. This was measurement. This was truth, even if it contradicted the instruments everyone else trusted. Peter spoke carefully, keeping his voice calm. "Sir, I have tracked magnetic deviation on every mission for 4 months. I have verified my celestial navigation against known landmarks dozens of times. My observations are consistent and accurate. The compass is reading 15 degrees high. Because of deviation, we are not correcting. If we stay on this heading, we will miss the target. The entire formation will miss. Schweinfurt is a small city. If we are 15 miles off, we will not even see it. We will drop our bombs on nothing, waste a mission, and lose aircraft for no result. Please, sir, trust my navigation. Turn south 15 degrees. Crawford stared at him. Every other aircraft is following the compass. Crawford said, "If I turn and you are wrong, we are alone." Peter nodded. "If I am wrong, I will accept full responsibility. Ground me, court-martial me, whatever is necessary. But I am not wrong." Crawford looked forward at the clouds, at the instruments, at the darkness outside. He keyed the intercom to the rest of the crew. "We are turning south 15 degrees based on the navigator's correction. Hold on." Then he banked the Halifax into a steady turn. The aircraft turned alone. The rest of the formation, invisible in the clouds, continued on the original heading. Peter watched the compass, watched the turn, calculated the new heading. Crawford leveled out, checked the instruments, and asked Peter how long until the target. 31 minutes, Peter replied. Crawford nodded and said nothing more. The aircraft flew south through the clouds, separated from the formation, alone in hostile airspace. Peter recalculated constantly, checking and rechecking his position. At 3:02 a.m., the clouds began to thin. At 3:09 a.m., the aircraft broke into clear air. Below, faintly visible in the pre-dawn darkness, Peter saw a river, the main river, unmistakable in its shape. He checked the map. They were exactly on track, 5 miles north of Schweinfurt. The deviation correction had worked. Crawford saw it too. He smiled, a tight, controlled expression of relief, and keyed the radio. "This is LKJ. We have visual on the target. Turning to attack heading. Other aircraft, if you can hear this, turn south 15 degrees from planned heading. Repeat, turn south 15 degrees. We are off track due to compass deviation. Follow my transmission bearing." 3 other bombers heard the transmission, turned, and followed LKJ to the target. The rest of the formation, 19 aircraft, continued on the original heading and missed Schweinfurt entirely, arriving over empty farmland, unable to locate the target, forced to drop their bombs on targets of opportunity or bring them home. But LKJ and the 3 aircraft that followed Peter's correction arrived precisely over the ball-bearing factories at 3:18 a.m. The bomb aimers acquired the targets, released their loads, and scored direct hits. Secondary explosions and fires erupted across the factory complex. The 4 aircraft turned for home, climbing back into clouds, pursued by anti-aircraft fire but undamaged. They returned to Linton-on-Ouse at 6:40 a.m., landing as the sun rose over Yorkshire. The debriefing was immediate and tense. The mission was evaluated as a partial failure. Only 4 22 aircraft had hit the primary target. The rest had scattered, wasted their bombs, and returned empty-handed. Squadron leader Crawford explained what had happened. His navigator had identified a compass deviation error, calculated correction, and guided the aircraft to the target. 3 other crews had followed his lead. The rest had stayed on the faulty heading and missed. The debrief officer asked how Peter had identified the error. Peter explained his method: celestial navigation combined with deviation correction. The officer asked if the method was authorized. Peter admitted it was not, that he had been ordered to stop using it. The room went silent. An unauthorized technique, used in defiance of orders, had just saved the mission. Flight Lieutenant Marsh, the navigation leader who had forbidden Peter's method, was present. Marsh's face was unreadable. The debrief officer asked Marsh directly if he had ordered Peter to stop using deviation corrections. Marsh confirmed he had, stating that the technique was unsafe, unverified, and contrary to doctrine. The debrief officer turned to Peter. "Did you understand that you were disobeying a direct order when you used this method?" Peter nodded. "Yes, sir." "Then why did you do it?" "Because the compass was wrong," Peter said quietly, "and I knew how to fix it." The matter was referred up the chain of command. Peter was confined to quarters pending an investigation. Crawford submitted a report defending Peter's actions, arguing that the navigation correction had been essential to mission success and that Peter had acted with skill and integrity. Other pilots who had followed Peter's transmission added their support. But regulations were regulations. Peter had been ordered to stop using an unauthorized technique, and he had disobeyed. The question was whether the results justified the disobedience. The investigation took 2 weeks. During that time, Peter's method was tested by the Bomber Command navigation staff. They reviewed his calculations, tested the deviation measurements, and compared his results to standard navigation data from other missions. The findings were unambiguous. Peter's technique was sound. Magnetic deviation in Halifax bombers was indeed variable and significant, often exceeding 10 degrees under operational conditions. Standard compass calibration did not account for this variability. Peter's method of using celestial navigation to measure and correct deviation in real time was mathematically valid and demonstrably more accurate than relying on compass headings alone. The navigation staff concluded that Peter's technique should be incorporated into standard procedures and that all navigators should be trained in deviation correction methods. The results of the investigation were communicated to Peter in early April 1943. He was cleared of wrongdoing. His technique was officially adopted, and he was promoted to flight lieutenant and assigned as an instructor at the navigation training school, where he would teach the deviation correction method to new navigators. Peter accepted the assignment, but felt conflicted. He was relieved to be vindicated, but he was also aware that 19 bombers had failed to reach the target because they had followed the rules while he had broken them. The system had been wrong, and correcting it had required disobedience. That troubled him. It suggested that doctrine was not always right, that individuals sometimes had to trust their own judgment over official guidance. That was a dangerous lesson, easily misused, but sometimes essential. Peter spent the remainder of the war as an instructor, training hundreds of navigators in the techniques he had developed. The deviation correction method became standard procedure in Bomber Command, reducing navigation errors and improving bombing accuracy. Post-war analysis estimated that the technique improved target acquisition rates by approximately 25% over the previous standard methods. That improvement translated directly into mission effectiveness. Fewer wasted sorties, fewer aircraft lost to navigation errors, more accurate strikes on strategic targets. Peter's unauthorized technique, the one he'd been ordered to stop using, had reshaped how the RAF navigated over Europe. After the war, Peter returned to Manchester and rejoined the family instrument business. The firm had survived the war and was transitioning back to civilian production. Peter applied his wartime experience to improving the precision and reliability of the instruments they manufactured. He developed new calibration techniques that accounted for environmental variables, ensuring that instruments remained accurate under diverse operating conditions. The business prospered. Peter eventually took over as managing director, ran the company for 30 years, and retired in 1975. He married, had 3 children, and lived a life that seemed, from the outside, unremarkable. But those who knew Peter well understood that he carried the weight of March 14th, 1943 with him always. He had been right when the instruments were wrong. He had disobeyed orders to follow the truth. And because of that disobedience, 4 bombers had hit their target while 19 had failed. The success was his, but so was the failure. If he had convinced Marsh earlier, if he had pushed harder to get his technique approved, maybe all 22 bombers would have reached Schweinfurt. Maybe the mission would have been a complete success instead of a partial one. Peter never resolved that tension. He had done what he believed was right, and he had been vindicated. But vindication did not erase the cost of the delay. The months spent proving what he already knew while missions failed and crews died. In 1968, a researcher from the Imperial War Museum contacted Peter while compiling a history of Bomber Command navigation techniques. The researcher had found references to the deviation correction method and wanted to interview the officer who had developed it. Peter agreed. During the interview, the researcher asked why Peter had continued using the technique after being ordered to stop. Peter thought for a long time before answering. Because I knew it was right, he said. Finally, I had measured it, tested it, verified it. The instruments were giving false readings, and I knew how to correct them. I could not ignore that knowledge just because someone with more authority than me did not believe it. The researcher asked if Peter thought his disobedience was justified. Peter's response was careful. "Disobedience is dangerous," he said. "Military discipline exists for good reasons. But so does truth. When the two conflict, someone has to make a judgment. I made mine. I was lucky that it worked out. But I understand why the system tried to stop me. You cannot have every junior officer deciding for themselves which orders to follow. That leads to chaos. So I do not know if I was justified. I just know I was right." The researcher's book was published in 1971, documenting the evolution of RAF navigation techniques during the Second World War. Peter's deviation correction method was featured prominently, described as a critical innovation that improved bombing accuracy during the Strategic Air Campaign. Peter received a copy of the book. He read the chapter about his technique, noted the technical details, and appreciated the recognition. But what stayed with him was not the praise. It was a realization that the system, for all its rigidity, had eventually adapted. His technique had been rejected, then tested, then adopted. The institution had been slow, frustratingly slow, but had ultimately corrected itself. That gave Peter a measure of peace. He had not been fighting the system. He had been trying to improve it. And in the end, the system had led him. Peter Hastings died in 1989, age 67, from heart failure. His obituary mentioned his wartime service, his career in the instrument business, his family. It did not mention the Schweinfurt raid, the deviation correction technique, or the disobedience that had led to both. His children knew fragments of the story, but not the full weight of it. After his death, they found his wartime navigation logs in a box in the attic, dozens of notebooks filled with star positions, compass readings, deviation calculations, all recorded in meticulous handwriting. They donated the logs to the RAF Museum, where they remain in the archive, a testament to one man's refusal to trust instruments that he knew were lying. The lesson from Peter Hastings and his compass trick is not about navigation. It is about the tension between authority and accuracy, between doctrine and truth. Military organizations depend on standardization, on procedures that ensure consistency and coordination across thousands of individuals. But standardization assumes that the standards are correct. When they are not, when doctrine is based on incomplete understanding or flawed assumptions, progress depends on individuals willing to question, test, and prove alternatives. Peter did that. He questioned the compass. He tested his hypothesis. He proved the correction method worked. And he did it despite being ordered to stop, because he understood that following bad guidance was worse than defying authority. The broader implication is uncomfortable. It suggests that disobedience is sometimes necessary, that individuals must occasionally override institutional directives to achieve mission success. But uncontrolled disobedience destroys organizations. The balance is delicate. Peter's disobedience was not casual or ideological. It was evidence-based, carefully tested, and motivated by mission effectiveness rather than ego or rebellion. He did not reject authority. He challenged a specific technical judgment with data. That distinction matters. Effective disobedience, if such a thing exists, must be grounded in verifiable reality, not opinion or preference. Peter had the data that made his defiance legitimate, even if it was still disobedience. The Schweinfurt raid itself, beyond Peter's individual contribution, became a case study in the difficulty of strategic bombing. Even with 4 aircraft hitting the target, the damage to German ball bearing production was less than hoped. The Germans dispersed their factories, increased imports, and substituted materials. The war did not turn on ball bearings, but it did turn in part on navigation, the ability to find and hit targets consistently, to put bombs where they were intended rather than scattering them across the countryside. That was the difference between effective and wasteful air campaigns. Peter's deviation correction method contributed to that effectiveness. It was one technique among many, but it mattered, and it existed only because a 21-year-old flight sergeant trusted mathematics over authority. Modern navigation has moved far beyond compasses and sextants. GPS provides precision that Peter could never have imagined, but the principle remains. Instruments fail. Signals are jammed or spoofed. Satellites go offline. And when that happens, navigators still need the skills Peter used, the ability to cross-check, to verify, to detect when instruments are lying, and to calculate corrections based on independent observations. The RAF and other air forces still teach celestial navigation, not because it is a primary method, but because it is the backup, the technique that works when everything else fails. That backup exists in part because Peter Hastings proved it was necessary. The periscope Danny Reeves built, the tunnel Thomas Ellery discovered, the compass correction Peter Hastings calculated. These are not stories about equipment or techniques. They are stories about attention, about noticing what is wrong when everyone else assumes everything is right. Danny noticed the ground sounded hollow. Thomas noticed the compass readings did not match the stars. Peter noticed the same thing. Each of them acted on that observation, built or calculated or reported something that contradicted official assumptions. And each of them, through that simple act of attention and response, changed outcomes. That is the thread connecting these stories. Not heroism, not genius, just the willingness to pay attention and act when something is wrong. Peter's compass trick was banned because it challenged doctrine. It was unbanned because it worked. That cycle, rejection and adoption, is how institutions learn. But the cycle depends on individuals willing to endure the rejection phase, to persist despite being told they are wrong, to prove their case through results rather than authority. Peter did that. He was ordered to stop. He stopped outwardly but continued testing privately. And when the moment came, when the mission required his technique, he used it despite the risk. That is courage of a different kind. Not the courage to face enemy fire, but the courage to face institutional disapproval and trust your own judgment. Both are necessary. Both are rare. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him,